I'd like to introduce our next presenter. This is Alex Lambrecht, who also worked on the Illyrian people and talking about their diet. So let's let him know.
All right. So, who's ready to see some more dead bodies? Now, right here, we're actually looking specifically at how diet changes over time in the city. We're not looking at just the population of the Illyrians because, see, over this time period, there's actually a whole bunch of different cultures that are occupying the territory. We see Neanderthals getting in here about 200,000 years ago, and even through the even more recent history, we've seen a whole bunch of different countries occupying this space. We have the Illyrians, the Greeks, the Romans, the Macedonians, the Celts. We even see the Byzantines and the Ottoman Empire at the very end, right? Now, the thing about Durrës in specific is that Durrës wasn't always called Durrës. In fact, the modern-day city of Durrës sits on top of the skeleton of a much older city, the city of Epidamnus. Now, the thing about Epidamnus is it was founded by the Greeks in 625 BC as a trading colony, right? The Illyrians weren't the most friendly group of individuals, but it was an attempt for the Greeks to sort of start trade with a new culture and sort of spread around. Now, for the purpose of this study, we're going to be looking at about a 2,000-year period of time, starting with the Archaic period at 800 BC and ending right up here at the Byzantine period at 1200 AD. Now, this study is testing the null hypothesis of no dietary change over time. These cultures were all heavily focused around agriculture, and so specifically cereal grains, and so we should see traits relatively focused around cereal grain diets consistently throughout the populations. Now, how are we going to use what we know about cereal grains to look at this data? See, the thing about cereal grains here is that they are full of carbohydrates. Now, carbohydrates aren't exactly the best energy source. Carbohydrates are full of sugar. And you know what loves sugar? Bacteria. Bacteria cannot get enough of the sugar. So what happens is the bacteria in your mouth, right, they love all the sugar that happens when you eat a bunch of cereal grains, and they start eating it all up and producing acids. Now these acids chew straight to your teeth. These right here, these are molars in your axillary, or basically your upper jaw, and these have dental caries, one of the most common kinds of pathologies. You've probably heard of these before in your average dentist office. Usually they're called cavities, right? So what happens in these dental caries is the acid eats right through all of the top enamel straight into the nice, squishy pulp of your tooth. Now, the second dental pathology of the three we're looking at today is abscessing. Abscessing is what happens when the acid doesn't just chew through your teeth, it chews all the way into your skull. This right here is a lovely abscess right up there. This individual was not eating healthy. Right here we have the third kind of pathology we're going to be looking at. Premortem tooth loss. Now, right here in the first mandible, you can see where that tooth was lost. What will happen is the acid can actually chew through the tooth, and they might just fall out. Now, there's a couple other things that affect your tooth loss over time. Periodontal disease, trauma. So you can lose teeth through other factors than your diet, but it is a factor in the number of teeth you lose. Another question you might be thinking of right now is, well, how do we tell the difference between a tooth that just fell out after the individual died and a tooth that fell out while the individual was still alive? And the reason we can tell is that it heals. Right here is a healed spot where the tooth fell out when the individual was still alive. However, if you look at this premolar right here, or this incisor right here, you see nice big gaps. So that means that either right around the time the individual died or much later, the individual, just a tooth fell out or something happened to the skull where we don't have that tooth anymore. So, why is this information significant? Why are we going to sit here and look at dead bodies all day long? Well, because there isn't actually that much information known about this area. Right? So when we're looking at this, it's actually helping us get a better understanding of how these cultures lived, what they were eating, that kind of thing. It's also helping us understand how cereal grains affect us nowadays. Humans haven't really changed since back then, so by looking at a long-term show of how cereal grains have affected their oral health, it gives us an idea of how they might affect ours in the modern day. So, how are we going to go about looking at these? Well, right here, we're going to actually take a look at these 4 time periods I mentioned earlier: the Archaic and Hellenistic period, the Roman period, the Late Roman period, and the Byzantine period. We're going to take the data we have, and we can actually sort out how old an individual is by looking at associated artifacts in the grave. A professional archaeologist can take a look at one of the burials of these individuals and hopefully get a pretty good idea of how old these individuals are. Now, you might be asking, why don't we just use carbon dating for everything? Because carbon dating is expensive. It takes a bit of time, and it can be, getting a good idea of the summary date can work just fine for what we're looking at. Now, the other 2 factors we're going to have to take into account are age and sex. Both of these are going to play a factor in how oral health changes. Age, well, the longer you've been alive, the more you've been eating this glucose, those carbohydrates, and the more you're likely to present one of these dental pathologies, or multiple of these dental pathologies we talked about earlier. Sex is kind of a weird one, but we actually see it in a lot of cultures. Men typically have better oral health. The reason for this is because men typically go out and do the hunting, and so when it gets time for everybody to start chowing down, guys tend to eat up more of the meat that's in the area. So overall, since protein and fat is typically a better diet, it's better for your teeth, if you have a diet rich in protein, you're less likely to exhibit these dental pathologies. So, how are we going to do this? Well, this is a set of data from my Archaic and Hellenistic populations. These are my dead bodies. The data was collected by my mentor, Dr. McElveen, in the summers of 2013 and 2015 from a collection of museums and other things in the area. And so right here we have all the data we need to take a look. These individuals up top, I exhibit all we need to know about, or everything we can tell about these individuals. Right? In the black here, this signifies that the individuals had both dentition and a maxilla or a mandible. As long as they had either a maxilla or a mandible, they still are capable of showing us if they had an abscess or lost their tooth before they died. So that way we can actually use to tell. These individuals right here in the yellow, however, only have teeth. They're missing their maxilla and their mandible. So all we can use those individuals for is to look for dental caries. These individuals in blue don't have teeth at all, so all we can use them for is to look for abscessing and premortem tooth loss. Right here in the red, those are the individuals we can't use for just about anything. We started with a sample of 177 individuals over this 2,000 year time period and broke it down into 118 individuals that we can check for dental caries and 120 individuals we can use to identify premortem tooth loss and abscess. Now, results. Ultimately, what we're looking at here is the frequency of the pathologies we see. So dental caries is the most common pathology as expected, and we see the highest frequency of these dental caries in our Archaic Hellenistic and Roman populations. Overall, it's these populations that have the worst health of the whole batch. Okay. Now, is the difference between our Hellenistic and Roman populations in premortem tooth loss. So if we look right here, though, no Romans had, or no Romans represented premortem tooth loss overall. So what do these results say? What ultimately is the bone, or what ultimately are the bones telling us? Well, for starters, that over time, your teeth get, or in this area, the oral health gets better. There is an improvement in oral health, refuting the null hypothesis. Now, this is strange. In most cultures, we don't actually see an improvement in oral health as time goes by. We see more and more of a reliance on these cereal grains. More and more cereal is being eaten, and we see worse overall oral health. We also see a weird little dip right here with the Roman. This is just because we didn't have any samples for that. Now over here we see our archaic, Hellenistic, and our Roman populations again, our late Roman populations, and the Byzantine. And you can see again in both of these graphs that big trace over time. Now, this is really, really strange. So to identify this, we're going to have to look at the effect of age. And from this, you can tell that overall, age doesn't really seem to affect the sample. It's pretty consistent in all the time periods of how we go about them. Now, right here you can see the tiny little bit of individuals we consider subadult, under 18. These right here in the red, these are our young adult populations. In the yellow, we have our mid-aged adult, so that's about 35 to 50 years old. And our old populations are here in green, over 50. Another weird thing about this data is that sex doesn't seem to play a factor in the results. Ultimately, we just don't see a lot of difference. It's no correlation right now. Now, there are some potential causes. You could just get an odd sample. Something happened so that with this particular group of individuals, they either had better or worse teeth than the rest of the group. But the thing to think about, though, is that Epidamnos was a port city. It was started by the Greeks to trade with the Illyrians. So a whole bunch of individuals are moving through and dying here. Right? Another thing to think about, though, is that it was a port city started by the Greeks. Right? Over time, we actually see less use of the port, and so the population of the port's getting smaller and smaller over time, meaning less of a reliance on this agriculture. You can start to hunt more, you can start to rely more on your ranching, which the area has a lot of, instead of having this heavy focus on agriculture, on these cereal grains. Now, conclusions. There is an improvement over time in oral health, refuting my hypothesis. There is a decreased, this leads us to believe that there's a decreased reliance on cereal grains in this area. Sex doesn't seem to come into play for how oral health can be observed in this area. And overall, in the modern day, we need to be careful with our use of cereal grains. They're not good for us. We need to start keeping that in mind when we go to open up our fridge. Now, these are my citations. And something to note with going forward in this research is there are still areas to go forward in. One particular thing that we didn't do as part of the study was to look at isotopic analysis, which would tell us the exact chemical compounds of what these individuals were eating. Right. Now, and these are my image credits and my acknowledgments. I'd like to thank you all for coming to see me today, and everybody here. Sean?